Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us for the Amplify STEM program again that we have hosted today. Before we officially get started, I'd like to express the MSU land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land seceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ariel Robbins. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Assistant Director of the NatSci's Charles U. Science Scholars Program. Welcome to Amplify STEMs, hosted by the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, Lyman Briggs College, the College of Natural Science, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. Amplify STEM seeks to honor and recognize different voices from within MSU and the broader community. These events amplify diverse voices and contributions within our community. We hope that each program is a learning opportunity to become more knowledgeable about issues that impact all of us. Michigan State University is one of 52 colleges that were created on lands allotted through the passing of the Morrill Act in 1862, which seized lands from tribal nations. The U.S. as a country has never come to terms with its foundation on land theft and genocide of Native peoples. For hundreds of years, the oppression of people in this country has led to the significant disparities we see today across all social systems in the United States. Events such as these seek to raise awareness about Indigenous peoples' perspectives and experiences that are often suppressed, overlooked, or forgotten, and to challenge the narratives of settler colonialism by recognizing and celebrating the deep and rich history, culture, and contributions of Indigenous people. We're so grateful to Professor Deborah McGregor for joining us today to share her knowledge on Indigenous knowing and climate futures.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kendra Pyle. I use she, her pronouns. I am the coordinator for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the College of Natural Science and also a graduate student in the School of Social Work. I'm so pleased to introduce Professor Deborah McGregor, Anishinaabe Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair, Indigenous Environmental Justice, Osgood Hall Law School, and Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, York University. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including environmental and water and governance, environmental and climate justice, health and environment, and Indigenous legal traditions. Professor McGregor remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research and initiatives. Professor McGregor has been at the forefront of Indigenous environmental and climate justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. Her work has been shared through the IEJ project website, which we will post into the chat. Please join me in welcoming Professor McGregor.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me at this session. I was noting to the planning committee that yesterday was International Women's Day, so there was an event out of Ottawa, which is our national capital region in Canada, on women in STEM. So this has been on my brain, I think, this whole week, this topic. So thank you for this opportunity to sort of orient it more to the Indigenous people side of things. I appreciated the land acknowledgement as well. It's actually the first assignment I usually get my students to do, to write one and acknowledge history and what their responsibilities are. So I appreciated listening to the land acknowledgements. I'm in Toronto, so I am Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, which is Manitoulin Island. You're around Michigan, and I'm Lake Huron, but still I'm Great Lakes Anishinaabe, so I like to think I'm still kind of place-based, even though I'm in Toronto and from Manitoulin Island, in relation to Michigan State University. So thank you for having me. What I want to talk to you about today, and I'm hoping, I really like this topic, so it's really hard to sort of stay under control in terms of my comments and time limit. But one of the favorite things I like to do in these kind of sessions is have conversations with people. So I want to make sure that there's some time for conversation and dialogue. I'm sure I would learn a lot from you as well in some of the work that I'm doing around STEM and climate justice. So I do have a PowerPoint, and all of this worked literally 15 minutes ago when we tested it. So hopefully it still works. Can you see this? Just make sure.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. So some of the work I've been involved in recently, and that I really started to see particularly huge gaps in knowledge. And I hadn't been super aware of this. I mean, in my field of Indigenous knowledge and applying it in forestry or water or climate or biodiversity or education, whatever it is that I'm being asked to do, I'm often asked by First Nations to help them out with a lot of their priorities. And if I can help in terms of research, because that's my skill set, I try to do that. And so I was asked to contribute to some the IPCC global assessments on climate change. And usually they're coming to Indigenous people the last minute, even there, because I believe they were critiqued for not engaging with Indigenous knowledge. And Indigenous peoples, to me, I don't know how you engage with Indigenous knowledges without engaging with Indigenous people. So that's one of the first things. And so they were trying to find people, after a lot of the other contributing authors had time to do the research and write their pieces. And I remember I was given a short period of time to talk about risk and vulnerability in relation to water security for Canada and the US, so First Nations and tribes. And I had to do this all in 400 words. And so it was really, what I found really challenging about it was the existing body of work you had to rely on. We had to use the last 5 years. There had to be certain things, words in the title, because of course the IPCC at the COP meetings, they're using these assessments. They're trying to convince nation states to take appropriate action in terms of policy development or funding programs, that they might have in their countries. So I found there was a huge gaps in relation to Indigenous knowledge and in the contribution of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge to these assessments, because of the criteria that they had for what had to be included, and this history of exclusion of Indigenous peoples from this space. So one of the ways I look at it is, if we weren't asking the right questions 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, 10 years ago, we actually don't have that body of work to rely on in order to do these assessments to even diagnose what climate change is in the first place, or all the elements of it, including justice and governance and everything else. So that was a real eye-opener for me. I also found in some of the climate change spaces that I find myself in the Canadian context, just a real lack of awareness of the distinct challenges that Indigenous peoples face and what their contributions can be to the narrative. So I started to try to formulate in terms of what can this start to look like, and that's hopefully what I'll be able to share with you today. And in terms of also thinking in terms of the future as well, like the climate change narrative right now, and we know that the European Union just came out with a report saying, okay, the planet has warmed up and we are not even meeting, the 1.5 target. We've already surpassed that. It's sort of very bad news. We're always getting this very bad news. So we don't really think about what kind of future do we actually really want and how can we actually move there. So the narrative right now is a very damage control kind of narrative. And I find that can be very hard on young people when they're trying to navigate the world that they're living in and how to take care of it. So hopefully I'll be able to do all of that in the next, at least you'll get a sense of my thinking, and hopefully we can engage in a conversation. So just, the land acknowledgements spoke to this. Indigenous peoples have always been here, always had our knowledge systems, our governance systems, and we had our own protocols for how we would enable sustainable relationships with all of creation. And the territories that we're in right now, so at Michigan State, where I am, at York University, and in Toronto, Indigenous peoples were there for thousands of years. So the knowledge that's there is thousands of years, and this knowledge is generally, well, for the most part, been ignored or not even known to exist in any kind of movement towards sustainability, whatever that might be, in whatever realm, fisheries or forest or whatever else. But this knowledge has been here and it exists and it's longstanding. And these knowledges supported Indigenous peoples as complete societies. So they were support decision making. And around the Great Lakes is actually quite diverse. So about an hour and a half from where I'm sitting now is 6 nations, which is literally 6 nations, right? So they have their own laws and their own knowledge and their own language, and how these would have enabled sustainability, how we had our own treaty making process long before contact of how we were going to work together and how we were going to get along in times of conflict. So essentially, Indigenous peoples were and still are sovereign, which was also acknowledged in the land acknowledgement as well. So I appreciated that. It was something I noted. So when that's my starting place, and when that's your starting place, you know that there's something to contribute from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems. And I'll talk a little bit more about the fact that, you know, we had our challenges too, and it's in our stories. And how did we meet those kind of challenges with our own knowledge, governance, laws, and languages. So Planetary Health Code Red, I just refer to these as the disaster reports. They just point to disaster, terrible things, not looking good in terms of the planet. The intergovernmental panel on climate change reports, the IPBES reports on biodiversity, the World Water reports, so that'll be coming out next month. They're all pointing to not great. So whatever it is that, you know, global climate governance or water governance, those aren't working. Things seem to be getting worse, as we saw from the European Union report from yesterday that was released. And but what they all do, all these reports, they call for transformative change. The business as usual, the tweaking of the business as usual, the status quo, that's not working. There needs to be a transformation of the way basically humans are relating to the natural world. So sometimes I refer to it as planetary health because they tend to be siloed reports, but really they're all pointing to this broader picture of how well we're doing and how well the planet is doing. The climate crisis. So one of the things I wanted to do in this talk is to talk about how we understand the crisis to be, the foundations of it to be different. Indigenous peoples and how it's framed in these broader frameworks, which so many countries and so many scientists and others contribute to. So this is just a piece that comes from Ariel Deranger. So she is the executive director for Indigenous Climate Action, which is, they're not associated with First Nation politics at all. They're separate. I guess they're like an ENGO, an Indigenous ENGO think tank. They engage in their own research kind of organization around climate change. And so they're free to think how they want. They're not stuck with the usual academic silos in terms of how we like to study complex problems and come to understand them. So she in this work points to different, I call them the other C words, capitalism, colonialism. In a lot of these circles that I find myself in with Government of Canada or this think tank that I'm involved in called Climate Choices, is very focused on carbon. And that is fair and that's true, it needs to be dealt with, but it's not the only thing that needs to be dealt with. It's not the only thing that we need to figure out how to deal with. Here I just really, so apologies that there's so much text. I just assume everybody could read and I don't need to read this, but just pointing out that Indigenous peoples have also been doing their own assessments of how planet's doing and how we're doing in relation to that planet. And these I see through the various declarations that have come from Indigenous peoples around the world. And so often starting with the Earth Summit in 1992, the Rio de Janeiro Conference, and various ones since then have come out with their own declarations that point to this is what we see as being the problem. This is where we think we need to go in terms of addressing the challenges that we're facing. And almost all of them point to our relationship as humans to the natural world, understanding the natural laws. We keep breaking those laws, we keep violating those laws, and then we end up with these disastrous situations that we find ourselves in. So, you know, I'm an Anishinaabe person from Whitefish River around Manitoulin Island, and I most certainly don't speak for all Indigenous peoples, but I'm pretty comfortable that so many people, so many different nations come to these gatherings and come up with these declarations and statements. You know, over time, over the last 3 to 4 decades, it would be, you know, so many different nations around the world that I think I can comfortably say this is kind of where the thinking around how Indigenous peoples conceptualize, you know, the challenges that we're facing. This is just one example. And because I tend to focus also on gender in my research, I chose one that was from a women's declaration. But it sort of they point to the problems, but they also point to where we need to go to address them. So I'm not going to read this, but this is essentially what my experience was. But I kind of read this material after I was involved in these assessments, and I was like so frustrated trying to do them. And basically, certain kind of knowledge dominates that landscape. So climate science tends to exclude Indigenous peoples and in women, except Indigenous people as subjects to be studied in these spaces. There was a report that came out by Overland in 2020. And what they did was they looked at what kind of climate research was published over the last 50 years. And they found that 780% of it, like 780% more times, was in the natural sciences compared to the social sciences and humanities. The issue there is women are generally excluded from that, especially if you're going back 50 years from that space. I mean, increasingly there's more women involved in that. Hardly any Indigenous peoples at all. Like we're not even talking about other folks, you know, BIPOC folks who also might be excluded from that. And that's been the body of work that's been relied upon to even define and diagnose and assess the problems that we're facing in terms of climate change. So it's very skewed in terms of the knowledge that we're relying on. And we see that bias reflected. Then there was the top 1,000 most influential climate scientists, most of them from the global north. Actually, surprisingly, I thought it would be the United States, but it was actually Northern Europe. And very few women, 122. And this report, I think, came out 2021. I doubt this has dramatically changed over the last couple of years. And none were identified as Indigenous. So you have this, so you can see there's this huge bias, but also a huge gap, particularly in terms of how do we generate solutions? Because when you get to define the problem, you also can generate the solutions. What's the path towards a future, you know, that we want? So I call it the ontology of climate change, because I started to realize that I found myself just reacting all the time, just going, oh, there's so many gaps. But it was also the underlying ontology and worldview associated with how we understand climate change. And so these are just coming from the United Nations. I'm not going to read them because you can find them easily, or this presentation is recorded, you can look at it. But it has a very specific idea about what the cause and what climate change is. Here's another one. I'm not going to read this. Apologies for all the text. It's usually just to keep me in line and as a reminder. Very technical, you know, scientific definition of what climate change is. Again, because a lot of the scholarship was in a certain area that was generating it. But it also means, again, influence is what we conjure up as being where we can move towards a sustainable future. And then I want to talk about sort of what some of the Indigenous ontology around climate change could be. So the Gonna Say a Key or Our Changing Earth gatherings. So these were held around the Turtle Lodge, just outside of Winnipeg in Manitoba, brought together elders and scientists and youth and knowledge holders, ceremonial holders. And they were having these discussions around climate change, very concerned about the future generations, current and future generations, and how well Mother Earth is doing. So not just these things happening to the Earth, but Earth as a living entity and having agency in and of itself. And they conceptualize climate changes are changing Earth. And so a little bit different. So they have a declaration that comes out of this, and I'll talk about a little bit further on in the presentation. It offers hope for the future. It's based on a different set of values. It acknowledges the leadership of Mother Earth, like maybe we need to learn from the Earth itself, because Earth is a lot older than we are. The Earth holds knowledge. This is sort of getting into Indigenous knowledge, ontology, I guess you could say. So it recognizes the Earth as having a say in also what's going on. It also said that as the Earth changes, so must we as people. So it isn't just us trying to intervene and change the Earth, but also we have to change as humans and people. So it had a different orientation to what I just kind of showed you in terms of like all this, right? It's a different ontology coming into play. Again, Indigenous folks shared that some of what we're calling climate disasters is the Earth's attempts to heal itself, to cleanse itself, but it's viewed very negatively. And I'm not saying it doesn't have negative impacts, and also I find what it's causing is this binary between people and the Earth. When I was involved in the development of Canada's national adaptation strategy, at the time there was floods going on in British Columbia. Now we know, like right now in California. So people were looking at nature or Mother Earth or the Earth is in a very negative way, in a very negative way. We have this battle, we have this war with the Earth. And I remember sitting in the meeting and feeling really actually kind of sick to my stomach. And I kind of thought, that kind of attitude is just creating like that chasm to be so much wider between people and the Earth, when Anishinaabe way of thinking is that we're actually one and the same and we have a close and intimate kind of relationship. The question should be, why is this happening? How can we have a better relationship with the Earth so we're not causing these problems? But that was the narrative. And so again, it's a different ontology how you think about what's happening. It's almost like climate change, like literally is a logical, rational outcome from the way humans have been impacting the Earth, particularly since industrialization. And the justice part of this is like primarily some humans are doing that, not everybody, probably the 1%. So this again comes from the Turtle Lodge Declaration. And the climate change is also the Earth communicating with us to tell us what we're doing to her and what's going on. So this was a quote from a young woman. So I facilitated a youth elders gathering on climate change a few years ago, and it brought in youth and elders from around Ontario, some from the fly-in communities. And there was a young woman there, Jade Willoughby, who said, climate change is the Earth communicating with us. That's what's going on. And we're interpreting them in very particular kind of ways as these disasters and this revenge of Mother Earth, like that kind of narrative. She saw it very differently. So there's a different ontology at play, and that's founded in, what one's relationships to the Earth are. And I just took this picture. It's literally in my front yard because it's really warm. Like I think today it's going to hit double digits in Toronto. Very unusual that the trees are starting to bud. And that's weird. Usually right now I'm kind of skiing on the lake or something. So there's dramatic. So what is the Earth telling us? These buds are coming out. It's a story. The Earth is telling us something. So Kyle White, so he was at Michigan State. So hopefully this isn't traumatizing or triggering anybody. Now at Michigan University. So he talked about that the climate change challenges that Indigenous peoples that are facing is an intensification of colonialism and environmental change. And this is actually really, really important, because what I found in a lot of these climate circles that I'm in, and I'm around those climate scientists that have been around for 4 decades and 3 decades and didn't ask the right questions. And I'm not saying they didn't do great work. They just didn't know what colonialism had to do with it. They didn't know how colonialism could be a constraint for Indigenous peoples in terms of self-determining their own future or coming up with their own solutions in terms of adaptation or resilience or mitigation, whatever the silos that we tend to talk about in climate change. They didn't see how that had to do with anything, or their science was such that there's sort of a line between what's environmental change and then what becomes climatic change. So when researchers would be doing work with Indigenous communities, particularly in the North, they would talk about, well, these changes are results of climate change. And the researchers would say, no, that's environmental change. So they were kind of distinguishing them. But for Indigenous peoples, in your lived experience, everyday reality, it's a continuum. And it's an intensification of colonialism. And that was not appreciated at all. Like people, because scientists aren't trained to understand that or understand that worldview and ontology and the lived experience of Indigenous peoples, because, research tends to look at Indigenous peoples as, people that you study, subjects that you study. That's a whole other conversation. But so I found that a lot in these conversations, this lack of understanding of how Indigenous peoples experience climate change. This is just an image of, there was just so many fires this past winter, or this past spring and summer and into the fall, and the impact on Indigenous peoples. So many communities had to be evacuated. And also you can't exercise your rights when the lands are burnt. And I don't want to think about what happened to wildlife in these spaces. So there's also the impact on the non-human relatives. A lot of the narrative that came out during these fires is this amount of land is being burned, this amount of carbon is being released, without really thought in terms of what does that do to our relationships to our non-human relatives. So he's framing it differently, that Indigenous climate studies is going to look a bit different because our assumptions are going to be different in terms of a binary between humans and the natural world, and a number of other assumptions. So again, this comes from the work from elders, that the earth has a voice, and the earth is expressing its agency in what we're seeing happening around the planet. And what we need to be able to do as humans, and we used to be able to do this, and actually probably all of us when we were kids, until unfortunately educators like me educated a lot of people, we used to be able to listen and observe and understand the earth, notice things. Now we're usually trying to rush from point A to point B as quickly as we can and not really notice what's happening out there, what the earth is trying to tell us in terms of what we're seeing. So here, I just had this particular moon. I'm Bear Clan. A full moon is coming. We just came out of one a couple of weeks ago. So we think about the earth as also having solutions to climate change. To some kind of strange extent, that is being recognized through the United Nations climate framework, which they call nature-based solutions. Same within Canada. But generally, it's still based on the assumption that humans are separate from nature. So like in Canada, it's like, how many trees can you plant? Because they're carbon sink. And I'm like, but you're already doing that anyway in relation to forestry, as opposed to the earth itself letting us know what actually needs to be done. So it still has, ontological assumptions there. The Pipe and the Eagle story, I don't have time to tell it right now. It's one of my favorite stories. I think of it as being a climate change story. But I guess one of the main points I wanted to make from this story is, in our stories, Anishinaabe weren't perfect either. We made mistakes. And usually those mistakes were when we were not behaving properly in relation to the natural world. We weren't following our laws. We weren't acting on our knowledge systems appropriately. We were being harmful to the earth and to our relatives, animals. And then there's a destruction. So in the Anishinaabe creation story, so there's a creation, we're given instructions, and then there's people behave very badly, then there's lots of warnings, then there's a destruction, and then there's a recreation of where, again, we're given instructions about how to behave properly and what our place is in relation to the natural world, with this coming a lot of values. So we weren't perfect. So we dealt with challenges. And a lot of the times sometimes we couldn't figure it out on our own. And we relied on the natural world. We relied on the earth in order to be able to help us. And in this story, it's the eagle that does. There's a destruction coming because people are behaving very badly. Again, the animals actually know. They know before people do, because they're attuned to the earth, and they send the eagle out to petition on behalf of people for current and future generations. And the eagle does this out of love. So again, different values coming into play. You don't see love mentioned in any of the IPCC reports, because I made an unfortunate graduate student check, but it always comes up in First Nation climate change meetings. And it's the eagle who bails us out of this dilemma. And the eagle has to find a family or people who are still following the laws, conducting the ceremonies, treating the earth properly. And essentially, if you continue to do those things, you're helping to heal that relationship, and I guess, for lack of a better word, heal the relationship with the earth, where it's been damaged. So in the stories, it's like, sometimes we're not. So there's humility in that story, that sometimes we are not clever enough to figure it out, and we rely on our relatives and the natural world to help us do that. That's what a lot of our stories tell us. So we always approach this with humility and love for future generations. So I'm not doing that story justice, just so you know. By that time, we would have started off with the story, and we would have unpacked it a bit and worked with it a bit more. So this is just Indigenous climate futures. So a lot of the narrative, again, is disaster, adaptation, resilience, and those are all important things. But we really haven't had a chance, particularly as Indigenous people, or I would say young people, to envision what does our future look like? What does our climate future look like? What do we need to do to figure out how we want to be in the world? What do we need to do, as opposed to the damage-centered, damage control type of narrative, or harm reduction? I heard one person call it the type of narrative that tends to be the dominant sort of way of talking about climate change. So for Indigenous peoples, a lot of this has to do with land and land-based activities. This is what ensured our adaptation and resilience. So Indigenous peoples, and again, I appreciated the land acknowledgements that were given, because they speak to genocide, removal from your lands. Like, in Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, very explicit genocidal policies in place. But here I am speaking to you saying, hey, I'm Anishinaabe, part of the Anishinaabe Nation, live in my community. And what enabled us to be able to survive these dramatic changes that have happened in our lives and generations, it was because of our own language and our own relationships to the land. It wasn't other people's solutions to solve, the Indian problem. So that's what's going to enable us to be able to weather and manage what we're facing in terms of climate futures as well. So this has to account for people's lived experience, rights and aspirations, and this history that we have. One of the ways I explained it is, the rest of the world is finally facing what Indigenous peoples have. Like, they're just going, oh my goodness, or annihilation. And I'm like, that's been kind of like Indigenous folks in, everyday lived reality for like 500 years or so on Turtle Island, right? So there's stuff you can learn from Indigenous peoples about how to survive dramatic environmental change as well. So having to recognize, I won't spend too much time on this because I realize I'm already after 12, that sometimes some people's solutions can be problematic for Indigenous peoples. And I did find that in a lot of these circles that I found myself in, that particular solutions might be proposed without thinking through what's going to be the impact on Indigenous people's rights. Does this even make sense in their lived reality? Or they tend to be very Southern, like to serve certain people and then not others. So often there's injustice in a lot of the solutions that are being proposed, again, because it's certain people proposing them. It's based on a certain body of knowledge without acknowledgement of other people's lived reality and contributions. And the thinking about Indigenous peoples as being part of climate change solutions. A lot of, really in Canada, a lot of our involvement in climate change has been other people are developing climate change plans and strategies, and we input into it as Indigenous people and our knowledge. We're not really given opportunity to develop our own plans and strategies of what we think our future is going to look like. There's really only two national strategies in Canada, the Inuit to Piricit and the Assembly First Nations that was just released a few months ago. And the BC First Nations have a climate change strategy. So I think the tribes are way ahead in that regard. So we're not being thought of as climate change governors, like people who want governance in our communities to be able to handle the kind of challenges that we're facing and where we want to go based on our lived reality. It's usually inputting into other people's stuff. So Indigenous climate change futures. So here I just want to sort of getting towards the end of the presentation. Oh, I should look at the chat and see if I need to be stopping soon. Nope, those are just 10 more minutes I have. Okay. So one of the things I'm trying to do in conceptualizing this, I'm having all these experiences. I'm getting a little frustrated in terms of, the body of work. There's very little in terms of Indigenous peoples and climate governance. Again, because we're feeding into other people's processes all the time. So in this project that I'm working on, Indigenous Climate Change Futures, I'm looking at how might we do our own assessments to start with. Again, there's been the global ones that I talked about and all these different meetings that Indigenous peoples go to. The framework, what is our framework for doing this? For Anishinaabeg, it would be different, I think, for Haudenosaunee than for Menominee and other, or Mushkegowuk Cree in northeastern Ontario. And the model that I use, and there's been not a lot of research on this, there's a bit, including from Kyle White and a couple other folks, is the 13 moon system. And because one of the comments that I get when I'm in these, I'll just call them climate change spaces and circles, is we don't really know exactly what happened in terms of climate assessment in Indigenous communities because we don't have the baseline. And I'll say, yeah, we do. It's the 13 moons. We know exactly what should be happening. Like in this moon coming up, what we're seeing around is actually that we're observing and experiencing, and it's not aligning with the stories that go with that particular moon, then we know like there's a problem. So over centuries and thousands of years, we have a lot of stories around each one of the moons. What should be happening, not just in terms of what's happening in relation to water, certain animals, other ecological kind of processes, how that influences how we would govern, decisions that we would make. So we actually already have that. So I'm working on a project where under each full moon, trying to document what some of those changes would be. What are we noticing different? And the reason I wanted this approach, because I want communities and people to understand they're their own climate change storytellers. Like in your lifetime, we're noticing these changes because it's happening so quickly. So if this were in a school, it could be starting with four-year-olds in junior kindergarten up to grade 12. They're going to be noticing already changes in that. What are you noticing? But you need a framework. You need a framework to be able to do that. And we're using the 13 moons. There's other ones, but this is one that kind of came up in, I would guess you could say, like our body of knowledge at the community level. It's starting to kind of percolate into the academic level. And the reason why the turtle is there, because the turtle actually connects to the 13 moons. There's the 13, the colored, I guess, parts on the back of the turtle. There's 13 of them, and around the edge there's 28. I don't remember. I'm not a biologist. I'm probably biologists in the crowd could put it into the chat. There's 28 of those, so it corresponds with the 13 moons. But it links water and what's on the land to the sky. So to the moon, like all of that's part of our conception of climate and our relationship to the natural world. It isn't just confined to what's like on the planet. So the scale is, so it's very local in terms of what's happening, let's say in Whitefish River, to even what's happening under a full moon in Toronto. But it also makes it very, the scale is also a lot broader than that, because we're also connecting to the moon, which is, you'll see it too, but what's happening around where you are could look quite different. So it's listening to the land, or a skill set to be able to do that. Again, I noted this, our own Indigenous knowledge systems were what we relied on to survive environmental change and colonial processes, historical and ongoing. This is my family in the sugar bush. Indigenous climate knowledge. I see Indigenous peoples as also, and others, having our own climate knowledge. It's beyond what we're seeing in the IPC reports, which are great reports. I've contributed to them. They're great reports, but there's still gaps there. And we have our own climate knowledge based on our legal traditions, how we experience it, in our languages as well. These are just some pictures from the elders youth gathering that I facilitated. We want to self-determine our own solutions. What do they look like? What our plans look like? Imagining our future, and you see, I don't know if it's on your right or your left. Love the earth. So the youth were producing knowledge in their own way and through art. And again, these ideas come up that these scientific meetings that I go to, they don't really talk about that at all. It's not a factor. An ontology of climate knowledge, Anishinaabe knowledge, embedded in our languages. So that means that language revitalization is a climate change strategy in a First Nation community or an Indigenous community. It's integral to that. Like, scientists kind of don't get that. Teaching about our 7 original teachings around how to be with each other and how to be with the earth. I'll just go through these a little bit more quickly. These are just sort of advancing some of those, that knowledge. And again, this acknowledgement that just advances in science and technology alone isn't going to get us there. So this is work that Vine Deloria Jr., the late Vine Deloria Jr. did in the US context for a very long time, talked about that in relation to Indigenous science. You need to develop the ethical and moral principles and behavior and guidance that go along with the advancement in science and technology. You see this with geoengineering. I think there's a lag with the ethical and moral part of the geoengineering efforts. We have our own stories, and actually in our stories too, we need to turn to the natural world. Usually humans are causing the problem, so this is the same as what IPCC has been saying as well. So we actually have our own climate knowledge and stories to draw on to guide us into the future. Our relatives, our non-human relatives, what stories is the earth telling us? You could go outside. I don't know what it's like where you are. I'm assuming it's kind of maybe similar to here. It's a lot warmer than usual. I literally saw insects outside, strange this time of year. So what is the earth telling us? Like what does that mean in terms of what we're seeing? What's the earth telling us? What our relatives telling us? Our kin. So we need to pay attention and need to notice these things. In our lives, we tend to get busy. We're rushing from point A to point B, and we're not paying attention. Our future, love in the earth. So this is my 2-year-old niece. She's helping out in the sugar bush. So our questions might be a little bit different. Do we love our future generations? So like the eagle and the pipe and the eagle story, petitioning on our behalf out of love for future generations. How will our work benefit future generations? And what kind of ancestor do we want to be? We're kind of, passing on problems to current and future generations. We need to start passing on solutions. So miigwech. And I think I managed to do that in 10 minutes. And sorry for, rushing through that. I like to talk about this, but happy to have a conversation and dialogue with some of you. Miigwech.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor McGregor, for a great talk. So we now will open the floor for any questions from the audience. And there are actually quite a few already in the chat. So I'll try to read some for you.
Okay.
So somebody wrote, as a scientist studying climate change, what are the ways to bring the language of love into how I talk about the research we do?
I think, I don't know if you're doing research with Indigenous people or not, because it's going to be there, I find. And as a scientist, that's going to be really hard, because I think meeting with other scientists and talking about love, people, like, I'm an Indigenous person, so everybody, an Indigenous woman, no less, in these circles, so I'm allowed to be kind of like the weirdo, like, oh, she's going to say something, whatever. But for a scientist, there's going to be some eyebrows raised. But I think in those, so this is where I'm going to kind of get a bit STEMmy on this, um, in those kind of spaces where there aren't Indigenous people, where you're not seeing a lot of diversity, where you're not seeing women or other genders, actually, for that matter, that there's a time, that would be the time to say we need to have those voices in there, even if it's not something necessarily that you're comfortable with. There's the advocacy that has to happen to get those other voices there that would speak to that. Because I'm quite aware that would be extremely awkward. Like, I'm imagining in my head right now some of the meetings that I'm in, and I just couldn't imagine any of them actually raising that. So there would be some advice I would give is to do the research to find where it is mentioned and to bring it up. Just say, Indigenous peoples think about this, like it's a way to think about how we want to take care of future generations. I don't even really hear that conversation happen in a lot of these spaces. Like, how is this knowledge going to help us take care of future generations? So that might be kind of another way to frame it, but it's a good question. And like, I'm literally imagining in my head these, folks around the table that I find myself. ENGOs are a little bit better about it, in my experience, but they also have their own agenda too as well. So that would be so that's sort of multi faceted, I guess, is just like, if it's not something you would bring up, because you certainly don't want to appropriate what Indigenous people are saying, but at the same time, you do need advocates in spaces where we're not there, as well. So there's a lot of STEM people here in the group who probably face this challenge as well and have more to say on that. But hopefully that was somehow helpful. There is more work coming out, like, from Indigenous perspectives on this that you could rely on, like, oh my goodness, there's actually research that points to this. But I think that might be one way to say it, because presumably we're all doing this work because we are trying to move towards sustainability. That is what we're trying to do, ideally, for future generations. So it shouldn't be so weird, but that's not the language. Like, that's not one of the silos in terms of how we approach climate change. So thank you for the question. Hopefully there was some little gem in there.
Thank you. So another question, what are some examples of land-based activities you would suggest?
Depends on where you are. So for me, like, this is how I kind of think about a land-based activity. So when I'm thinking about folks going out for the fall hunt, or pretty soon, I mean, who knows? I don't know how long this kind of weird, kind of warm weather is going to last, but where I'm from on Manitoulin, it would be like another month from now, you'd be opening up sugar bush. When people are out on the land, so the way that climate change research tends to work is, like, there's monitoring, mitigation, although most people sort of don't know if that's happening anymore, adaptation, then resilience, maybe governance, certainly starting to kind of go there in the Indigenous context, risk and vulnerability assessment. So there's all these different silos, and different people kind of approach those kind of questions and research differently depending on their disciplines. And but for Indigenous people, when they're out on the land, whether it's hunting in the fall hunt, let's say, which McGregor Cree are, you're doing all of those. You're monitoring. You're like, how are the plants doing? Where do we need to be? What's the wetland like? So people are monitoring all the time. They're not just saying, hey, I'm monitoring, and or fitting it into some database somewhere. They're also assessing risk and vulnerability. Is it safe? Like, what's safe? Things are changing. And you're mitigating because you're not having a big impact on the natural world. Like, let's say anything anybody might be doing in Toronto. So you're mitigating, you're adapting to whatever kind of situation might be. Maybe your hunting season shifts. We used to know exactly when that was actually, but now it's kind of shifting a bit. And then you're adapting and you're building resilience around that. Maybe we need to incorporate other ways that we need to be out there on the land, or the timing that we have out on the land. So when you're in those kind of situations, all of those things are happening. And and it doesn't matter what it is. So when my family goes out into the sugar bush in about a month's time, we're going to be doing the same thing, let's say with one activity, for lack of a better word. Like you're going to be monitoring, you're going to be assessing risk. Because one year we had to stop because of fire risk, because we don't have a lot of snow, and you need to have snow because the snow melts nice and slow into the earth. It was too dry, we had to stop. We had because you can't be burning because we burn, like you saw in the picture. So those kind of activities are including all of that. And the other thing it's doing is it's generating Indigenous knowledge. People are speaking the language, you're generating and transmitting Indigenous knowledge, transforming Indigenous knowledge. But the reality of the situation is there's fewer and fewer people who can do that. Meanwhile, there's more interest in it. More interest in Indigenous knowledge, but the number of people who actually can engage in it is getting smaller. And I know this in my own work. In a couple of weeks, I go to a community to help them with their traditional knowledge study. They're having a hard time finding people for me to talk to. 20 years ago, they wouldn't have had that problem. So if you're engaging in these activities, actually building it and engaging with it, and people are speaking the language and learning about the natural worlds around them, those kind of activities in urban areas, because I do get my students to do this. You can still see the moon, hard to see the stars. So you can still notice things happening around when the moon is out. Their assignment right now is it's going to cross. So they would have started January. It's actually kind of around when there was a storm, and it'll be due just before the equinox, so about a week before. So the light's going to have changed dramatically, to really start to notice the changes. And first, that's the first thing I tell them. What are you noticing? Hard for them. These are law students or graduate students. They're like, but I never think about that. Like, I just try to rush to school or catch the subway or whatever, right? They're not paying attention. Now I'm asking them, what are you learning from that? So if you're seeing when an animal is nocturnal and it's out during the day, like you should be noticing things that are odd. So it's really trying to get people to kind of notice, just to notice. And that, like, to me, that's simple thing to tell people, because I see it all the time. I probably did this to my own kids, is, they notice everything. Like they're squatting on the ground and they're looking at the ants and they're looking at everything. And then we come along as adults and caregivers and say, could you hurry up? We're trying to get to school on time. Could you move along? We basically teach them not to notice anymore. Yep. Right? They'd be noticing. And so that's one of the big things I do, is just trying to get people to just connect and to notice things, and to know that those things actually matter. I pay attention to matter, So, and they do. Like, I've just returned the assignments, and they're getting there, and they're kind of freaked out when I said, "But what are you learning from that?" They're like, "What?" Like, so I have more work to do in terms of trying to teach what that might look like, and how to notice, and then how to try to interpret what they're experiencing it. Because that's what we're asking people to do. How do you interpret what you're experiencing? Because mostly what we do as academics is we're reading stuff, and that we're reading someone else's interpretation and kind of working with that, agreeing or disagreeing or whatever, right? But how do you process your own experience and interpret that is a different skill, which we used to be able to do when we were smaller. And the way that we educate, we favor stuff that's written as opposed to experienced. So yeah, hopefully that's kind of helpful. Like, there's that lived reality, and I go, it totally breaks down those silos, the hunt or being in the bush or whatever. That all of those are experienced in like one thing. And then there's, how do we start reteaching people how to connect back to the natural world? Hopefully that was somewhat helpful.
So we have a few questions. We only have a few minutes, but you mentioned the sugar bush a couple of times. Somebody's asking that in their Facebook page, they see that there is a call for holding sugar bush this year. Is that something you have been seeing as well? If so, what happens if this kind of year continues to happen? Will we be able to get back to sugar bush at some point? So, is there a
Okay. It's because it's so warm right now. So some people are getting excited to open up the sugar bush. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a panel with a young woman who runs a sugar bush more in Southern Ontario. But others are just saying not to do that. That was actually the advice of my dad. So this did happen, I don't even know how many years ago, where it got really warm in February. You start seeing the buds on the trees, and some people did open up the bush, but usually there's another cold snap. That's not good for the trees. Because you need certain conditions. We have a lot of stories actually around why we have where we got the sap and maple syrup, because usually it was around the time of major food insecurity for Indigenous people. So it's like a gift to us. So it's kind of a big deal. They say hold off. There's going to be another cold snap. So if it's the same as what my father said about how we ran our bush, that was why there's going to be another cold snap, and you are going to get that time later. So that's my guess on that. But a lot of people are feeling really tempted.
So I'm gonna read one of the last questions we got. What specific climate solutions are you supportive of that account for Indigenous people's worldviews? Perhaps really quickly, but it's important.
I would say supporting what it is at First Nations, trying to support I guess the life ways of Indigenous people. Now that sounds really big. So respecting rights, if people want language revitalization programs, because one of the things they know is where so 80% of biodiversity on the planet is under the care of Indigenous peoples. Around 20% of the landmass is Indigenous people, but that's where 80% of the and that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. Poorly understood, obviously understood by Indigenous people, but in the academic world, they're trying to figure that out. So I would say whatever's going to support that, particularly young people's land-based kind of activities, so we're not educating this out of them. How do we retain it? Like, how do you retain it and revitalize it? Would be the advice that I would give. Even little things are going to help that.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we have to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'll stop it here. A really big thank you for you, Professor McGregor, and for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today. And I would like to also thank everybody attending this Amplify STEM event, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thanks everybody for joining me, and hopefully there was some gems in there. At least if you can find one thing, I'll be happy.
And we did have more questions, so if you don't mind, perhaps I'll send them to you, and perhaps we can communicate some answers back to the people.
Public domain, people usually can track me down. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon. To me, watch. I'm assuming we're done.
Yeah, we're waiting for a couple of